My name is Jade, and I am 32 years old. I inherited my grandparents' beautiful Victorian house, the place that became my true home after my mother sent me away at age 9 to move in with her new husband and his son. I thought that chapter of rejection was closed until 20 years later, when they suddenly reappeared in my life demanding the house that had sheltered me when they wouldn't. Some people really will try to hurt you twice in the same lifetime. If you're watching this video, let me know where you're viewing from, hit that like and subscribe button, and settle in for a story about fighting for what truly belongs to you. I was 5 years old when my earliest clear memories begin. My mother Sarah and I lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. The furniture was mismatched, the carpet was worn thin in places, but it was home. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, waitressing at a local diner during the day and taking retail shifts at a department store on weekends. Despite our financial struggles, we had a special bond. On her rare days off, she would make chocolate chip cookies from scratch, and we would curl up on our secondhand couch watching Disney movies. She would wrap me in her arms, smelling of vanilla extract, and that cheap perfume she loved telling me, "It's just you and me against the world, Jade." I remember helping her get ready for dates sometimes. She would let me sit on the bathroom counter while she applied makeup, explaining each step like it was a sophisticated art form. "Beauty takes effort, sweetie," she would say, carefully applying mascara. I thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world with her wavy auburn hair and bright smile that lit up her tired eyes. Everything changed when I was 8. My mother came home one evening practically floating, her eyes shining with excitement. "I met someone special today, Jade," she said, twirling around our tiny living room. "His name is Richard, and he owns his own business. Can you believe it?" Richard was tall, with perfectly combed dark hair, always dressed in crisp suits that looked expensive even to my young eyes. The first time he came to our apartment, he looked around with a slight grimace he tried to hide. He brought me a doll that was nicer than anything I owned, but there was something calculated about the gesture. "What do you say to Mr. Campbell?" my mother prompted. "Thank you," I said, clutching the doll. "Smart girl," he replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. As weeks passed, my mother transformed before my eyes. She started wearing new clothes, styling her hair differently, using phrases I had never heard from her before. She was constantly checking her phone for messages from Richard, her face falling when the screen remained dark. "Do you like Richard?" she asked me one night as she tucked me in. I hesitated. "He seems nice," I lied, not wanting to disappoint her. "He has a son, too. Ethan. He is 11. Wouldn't it be nice to have a brother?" I nodded uncertainly, not sure if that was what I wanted at all. The first time I met Ethan was at a restaurant Richard had chosen. It was fancier than anywhere my mother and I had ever gone, with cloth napkins and multiple forks. Ethan barely looked at me, answering in monosyllables when his father prompted him to speak. "My dad says your mom was a waitress," he finally said when the adults were distracted. "Does that mean you guys are poor?" My cheeks burned with embarrassment. "We are not poor," I protested, though I knew we had less than many of my classmates. "Whatever," he shrugged. "Dad says we might all live together someday, but I told him I don't want to share my stuff with you." As Richard became a more permanent fixture in our lives, the atmosphere in our once peaceful home grew tense. Richard and Ethan would visit our apartment, Ethan complaining loudly about how small it was while Richard made suggestions about upgrading various aspects of our lives. My mother stopped baking cookies. Our movie nights became rare. Instead, she was always rushing to meet Richard's expectations, coming home exhausted from trying to impress his business associates at dinner parties. One night, I woke to the sound of harsh whispers from the living room. "She is just not adjusting well, Richard. Give her time," my mother pleaded. "Time isn't the issue, Sarah. Ethan feels uncomfortable around her. She doesn't fit into our lifestyle. You know my house isn't really set up for 2 children." "What are you suggesting? Your parents have that big house." "She would have more space there. It would just be temporary until we all adjust." "Send Jade away. I couldn't possibly." "Do you want this to work between us or not? I'm offering you and Jade a better life, but there need to be compromises." I crept back to bed, my heart pounding. Surely my mother wouldn't send me away. We were a team, just the 2 of us against the world. She had promised. A week later, my mother sat me down, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Jade, honey, I have something important to tell you. You're going to stay with Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Frank for a little while." "But why?" I asked, my voice small. "Richard and I need some time to set up our new life together. His house needs renovations to make room for you. It's just temporary, sweetie. You love visiting Grandma and Grandpa, right?" I nodded mutely, tears welling in my eyes. "It's just for a little while," she repeated, pulling me into a hug that felt different somehow. Looser. Like she was already letting go. The day my mother drove me to my grandparents' house, she was wearing a new diamond bracelet. As she helped unload my suitcases, the diamonds caught the sunlight, scattering tiny rainbows across the porch of the Victorian house that would become my home for the next 20 years. The Victorian house loomed before me, 3 stories of faded elegance with a wraparound porch and gingerbread trim. My grandparents stood on the porch steps, Grandma Eleanor wiping her hands on her apron. Grandpa Frank's kind eyes crinkling with concern behind his glasses. They welcomed me with open arms, though I could see the silent questions in their glances at my mother. "The guest room is all ready for you, Jade," Grandma said, squeezing my shoulder. "Though we won't call it that anymore, will we? It's your room now." I watched from the upstairs window as my mother's car disappeared down the long driveway, her promise to call every day and visit on weekends echoing in my ears. Grandma found me there an hour later, still staring at the empty road. "Your grandfather is making his famous pancakes for dinner," she said gently. "It's his solution to most problems, I'm afraid." That first night in my new bedroom, surrounded by floral wallpaper that had probably been there since my mother was a child, I cried myself to sleep. I clutched the stuffed rabbit I'd had since I was a baby, the one item that smelled like my old home. In the morning, I discovered that Grandma had slipped in during the night and placed a glass of water and a small vase of fresh flowers on my nightstand. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment. My grandparents enrolled me in the local school, bought me new clothes when they realized how little my mother had packed, and created gentle routines that gave structure to my days. My mother called twice that week, her voice bright and artificial, full of stories about the renovation plans for my room in Richard's house. Grandpa Frank's workshop became my favorite place. It occupied half of the detached garage, filled with the comforting smell of sawdust and varnish. He was working on restoring an antique rocking chair when I first ventured in. "Want to help?" he asked, handing me a piece of fine sandpaper. "This chair is older than me, if you can believe it, made back when people built things to last." As I carefully sanded the arm of the chair, the repetitive motion somehow soothing, Grandpa told stories about the house. "Your grandmother's family has owned this place for generations. When I married her, her father wasn't too sure about me. I spent 5 years restoring every inch of this house to prove I was worthy of his daughter and her family home." The calls from my mother grew less frequent. There was always some excuse, some reason why she couldn't visit that weekend. The renovation was taking longer than expected. Richard had an important business trip. Ethan had a soccer tournament. "Just a few more weeks," became her refrain. The first major holiday away from my mother was Thanksgiving. Grandma taught me how to make her famous pumpkin pie, letting me measure the spices and crimp the edges of the crust. "Your mother loved doing this when she was your age," she said, a shadow crossing her face. My mother called that morning, promising she would try to stop by in the afternoon. She never came. As Christmas approached, Grandma helped me make ornaments for the massive pine tree Grandpa brought home. We strung popcorn and cranberries, made stars from silver paper, and hung the glass icicles that had been in the family for generations. "Your mom is definitely coming for Christmas," I told my new friend Taylor from school, who had been sympathetic to my situation. "She promised." On Christmas Eve, the phone rang. I raced to answer it, certain it was my mother confirming their arrival time for tomorrow. "Jade, sweetheart." My mother's voice sounded strained. "I have some bad news. Ethan has the flu, and we don't want to get you and your grandparents sick. We're going to have to postpone our visit." I was silent, the familiar disappointment washing over me. "Are you there, Jade?" "Yes," I whispered. "Richard got you some amazing presents. We'll bring them when we visit, okay? It'll be like having a second Christmas." That second Christmas never came. January turned to February, winter melted into spring, and the pattern was established. My mother existed primarily as a voice on the phone, growing more distant with each call. Meanwhile, my grandparents folded me into their lives completely. Grandma Eleanor taught me to garden, explaining the names and needs of each plant in her extensive beds. Flowers are like people, she told me. Some need lots of attention, others thrive when left alone, but they all need good soil to put down roots. In school, I gradually made friends, though I was initially quiet and withdrawn. Taylor's parents often invited me over for play dates and included me in their family outings. "You're always welcome here," Taylor's mom would say, giving me the kind of hugs I missed from my own mother. One day, about 10 months after I'd come to live with my grandparents, I discovered a photo album in the library bookshelf. It contained pictures of my mother growing up in this very house from infancy through high school graduation. The similarity between us was striking: the same eyes, the same smile. In the early photos, she looked happy, surrounded by the love of her parents. In the later teenage photos, I noticed a change, a hardness around her eyes, a distance in her smile. On the last page was a note in my grandmother's elegant handwriting: "Sarah, remember that you are always loved, always welcome home, no matter what." I realized then that my mother had left this house once before, had perhaps felt as trapped here as she later felt in our small apartment with me. The difference was that her parents had always left the door open for her return. Somehow I knew she wouldn't do the same for me. That night I cried not just for myself, but for the cycle that seemed to be repeating itself. When Grandma found me sobbing in the window seat, clutching the photo album, she simply sat beside me and held me until the tears subsided. "She's not coming back for me, is she?" I finally asked. Grandma's silence was answer enough. By the time I turned 14, I had settled into life with my grandparents and in the small town that had become my home. The Victorian house no longer felt foreign, its creaky floorboards and secret corners as familiar to me as my own reflection. I had grown several inches, my childhood roundness giving way to teenage angles, my once short hair now falling past my shoulders. School had become a place of comfort rather than anxiety. I had a small but solid group of friends, with Taylor remaining my closest confidant. My teachers praised my writing abilities and encouraged my growing interest in history and architecture, subjects that seemed to connect me to the bones of the house I lived in. My mother's calls had dwindled to major holidays and my birthday. When she did call, the conversations were superficial, filled with awkward pauses and questions about school that showed how little she knew about my life. The summer I turned 15, my mother announced they would be visiting. "Richard has a business meeting nearby," she explained on the phone. "We thought we'd stop by for lunch." I spent the morning of their visit helping Grandma prepare an elaborate meal. My stomach knotted with anticipation. When their luxury SUV pulled into the driveway, I watched from behind the curtains, suddenly shy about facing the woman who had once been the center of my universe. The woman who stepped out of the car barely resembled my memory of my mother. Her hair was expensively highlighted and styled, her casual outfit probably costing more than my entire wardrobe. Diamond studs glittered in her ears, matching the wedding set on her left hand. Richard emerged, looking much the same as I remembered, followed by Ethan, now 16 and nearly as tall as his father. "Jade," my mother said when she saw me, her arms outstretched for a hug that felt formal and brief. "Look how you've grown." Throughout lunch, I watched my mother glance around the house with a mixture of nostalgia and something else, perhaps relief that she no longer lived here. Richard dominated the conversation, talking about their new vacation home in Florida and Ethan's prospects for college athletic scholarships. "And what are your plans, Jade?" Richard asked, as if suddenly remembering I was there. "I'm interested in architectural preservation," I said, finding my voice. "There's a summer program at the community college I'm hoping to attend next year." "How unique," my mother said with a thin smile. "Though there's not much money in that, is there?" After lunch, my mother asked to see my room. As we climbed the stairs together, an uncomfortable silence stretched between us. "This was my old room, you know," she said, running her fingers along the banister. "Before I moved to the larger one in high school." "I know," Grandma told me. My room reflected my emerging personality, walls painted a soft blue instead of the original floral bookshelves filled with novels and architectural textbooks, a desk where I worked on sketches of historic buildings in town. It's nice, she said, picking up a framed photo of me with my grandparents at the state fair. Your grandparents have done well with you. They've been amazing, I said, a protective edge entering my voice. She glanced at me sharply. I hope you understand why things happened the way they did, Jade. I was young, struggling. Richard offered stability. For you, I said quietly. She sighed. You could at least call me Sarah now. Mom makes me feel so old and we're more like sisters now, aren't we? The request felt like a physical blow. Before I could respond, Ethan appeared in the doorway. Dad wants to leave soon, he announced, looking around my room with barely concealed disdain. Nice setup, I guess, if you like ancient houses. Thanks, I replied dryly. As they prepared to leave, my mother handed me a gift bag containing an expensive sweater 2 sizes too small. Richard picked it out, she said. We should go shopping next time you visit us. I had never been invited to visit them, not once in 6 years. After they left, I sat on the porch swing processing the strange afternoon. Grandpa Frank joined me, his presence comforting in its solidity. They've turned my old bedroom into Richard's home office, I said suddenly. My mother mentioned it while showing me pictures of their house on her phone. There wasn't a trace of me in any of those photos. Grandpa nodded slowly. Sometimes people make choices that are hard to understand. Ethan has everything, I continued, the unfairness bubbling up. Private school sports cars, college funds. She chose him over me. She chose Richard, Grandpa corrected gently. And with him came certain complications. That conversation marked the beginning of a difficult phase. I started testing boundaries, staying out past curfew, arguing with my grandparents over minor issues. My grades slipped as I channeled my hurt into rebellion. After I was caught skipping school with some seniors, Grandpa invited me to the workshop where he was restoring an antique desk. Hand me that chisel, he said, not mentioning my recent behavior. As we worked side by side, he spoke quietly. My father left when I was 12. Just packed up one day and moved across the country with a woman from his office. Started a new family rarely called. I looked up in surprise. He had never shared this before. I acted out much worse than you're doing now. Nearly got expelled. He carefully fitted a new piece of wood into the desk drawer. What I didn't understand then was that his leaving wasn't about me. It was about his own weaknesses. But he was the adult, I protested. He was supposed to stay. Yes, Grandpa agreed. Just like your mother was supposed to stay. Adults fail sometimes, spectacularly so, but their failures don't define your worth. His words penetrated the armor I'd been building around my heart. During my junior year, Grandma Eleanor was diagnosed with breast cancer. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, watching my strong grandmother become temporarily frail from treatments. I took on more household responsibilities, cooking meals I'd learned at her side, tending her beloved garden. My brave girl, she would say, watching me arrange fresh flowers beside her bed. What would I do without you? My mother sent flowers and impersonal cards, but visited only once during Grandma's 6 months of treatment. Sarah seemed uncomfortable in the sick room, staying just long enough to fulfill her obligation before returning to her life with Richard. When Grandma finally received the all-clear from her doctors, we celebrated with a garden party. Taylor's family came along with neighbors and friends who had supported us through the ordeal. My mother called to say they couldn't make it something about Ethan's college visitation schedule. As I helped Grandma into her favorite garden chair surrounded by the flowers we had tended together, I realized that the pain of my mother's abandonment had transformed. The sharp edges had worn smooth like a stone tumbled in a river. In its place was a profound appreciation for the people who had chosen to love me day after day through every ordinary moment and crisis. We make quite a team, don't we? Grandma said, squeezing my hand. The best. I agreed, finally understanding that family was more about presence than blood. The thick envelope from State University arrived on a crisp fall day during my senior year. Grandpa Frank brought in the mail, his eyes twinkling as he handed me the distinctive package. This looks important, he said, trying to hide his smile. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. I got in full academic scholarship, I shouted, waving the acceptance letter. Grandma Eleanor hurried in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Read it out loud, dear. Every word. That evening we celebrated with a special dinner. Grandpa opened a bottle of champagne and allowed me a small glass. "To our Jade," he toasted, his voice thick with emotion. "The future is yours to build." I called my mother with the news, leaving a message when she didn't answer. She texted back later. "Congratulations. Richard says State has an excellent business program." I had been accepted to the architectural preservation program, a detail I had mentioned in my message. Her response was typical of our relationship, a surface acknowledgement without real engagement. College opened new worlds for me. I thrived in classes about historical architecture, structural engineering, and urban planning. My professors recognized my passion and encouraged me to pursue internships with preservation societies during summer breaks. During sophomore year, I met James in a historical materials course. Tall, with thoughtful brown eyes and a quiet confidence, he shared my love of old buildings and their stories. Our first date was spent exploring an abandoned 19th century mill on the edge of campus. "Look at these joints," he said, shining his flashlight on the timber frame construction. "No nails, just perfectly fitted wooden pegs. They don't build like this anymore." His appreciation for craftsmanship reminded me of Grandpa Frank, creating an immediate connection between us. Each summer, I returned home to my grandparents, working internships with the local historical society. Grandpa taught me more about home maintenance, explaining the systems that kept the Victorian house functioning. "This house has stood for over a century," he said as we repaired a section of gutter. "With proper care, it'll stand for another century after we're gone." During my junior year summer, Grandma Eleanor took me aside one evening. She had fully recovered from her cancer, though the experience had left her more deliberate about life's important matters. "I want to talk to you about something important, Jade," she said, leading me to the study where Grandpa Frank was waiting with some papers. "We've updated our will," Grandpa explained. "We want you to know that this house will come to you when we're both gone." "But what about Mom?" I asked, surprised. Grandma and Grandpa exchanged glances. "Sarah has made her choices," Grandma said gently. "This house needs someone who loves it, who understands its value beyond mere property." "We've discussed it with Sarah," Grandpa added. "She has no interest in maintaining a house of this size and age. She and Richard prefer newer construction." The conversation felt weightier than my 20 years seemed prepared to handle, but I understood the trust they were placing in me. I graduated college with honors in architectural preservation and a minor in business administration. James attended the ceremony with my grandparents, their presence filling the family section reserved for graduates. My mother sent an expensive fountain pen set with a card signed by her Richard and Ethan. She explained that a business emergency prevented their attendance. By then, I expected nothing more. The Preservation Society where I had interned offered me a full-time position after graduation. The job would allow me to remain in my grandparents' town, working to protect historic properties from development and neglect. I accepted without hesitation. James found work with an architectural firm specializing in restoration, allowing us to continue our relationship. We talked of a future together, though we agreed to move slowly, building a solid foundation. In the autumn following my graduation, Grandma Eleanor's health began to decline again. This time the cancer had returned, spreading to her bones. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about comfort measures and quality of life. I moved back into the Victorian house, permanently helping Grandpa care for her. Each evening I would sit beside her bed, reading from her favorite books, or simply holding her increasingly frail hand. "I have something to tell you," she said one evening when the pain medication had eased her discomfort. "I want you to know that bringing you here was the best thing that ever happened to this old house. You brought youth and life back to these rooms." "You and Grandpa saved me," I whispered. "No, dear. We merely provided the space for you to save yourself." She squeezed my hand weakly. "Promise me you'll remember that strength when I'm gone." "I promise," I said, tears slipping down my cheeks. "And forgiveness, Jade. Not for others, but for yourself. Don't carry anger as your companion through life. It's too heavy a burden." Grandma Eleanor passed peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks later, with Grandpa Frank and me holding her hands. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire town, a testament to the lives she had touched. My mother arrived with Richard and Ethan dressed immaculately in designer mourning clothes. She hugged me briefly, her perfume expensive and unfamiliar. "She looked exactly the same when I saw her last," she said, though it had been nearly 2 years since her last visit. As I watched my mother move through the funeral reception, accepting condolences for a relationship that had existed more in theory than practice for decades, I felt a strange detachment. The wound of her abandonment had scarred over, no longer raw, but still marking the landscape of my heart. The months following Grandma Eleanor's death were difficult for both Grandpa Frank and me. The Victorian house felt emptier without her presence, her garden bereft of her tender care. I took over the cooking and household management, trying to maintain the routines that had structured our lives. Grandpa spent more time in his workshop channeling his grief into creating beautiful pieces from wood. I would bring him lunch, often finding him lost in thought, running his fingers over the grain of an oak plank or mahogany board. "Your grandmother could identify any wood by smell alone," he told me one day. "Used to say each one had its own voice, too. Said oak spoke of strength, pine of simplicity, cherry of joy." I began documenting Grandpa's knowledge of the house, recording his stories and maintenance tips. The Victorian had so many quirks, from the radiator in the dining room that needed regular bleeding to the attic window that had to be propped just so during summer thunderstorms. "This house was built by craftsmen who took pride in their work," Grandpa explained as he showed me how to repair a section of ornate plaster molding. "Most problems can be solved if you understand the original intention behind the design." My career at the Preservation Society flourished as I applied my education and personal experience to protecting the town's historic buildings. I was becoming known in preservation circles throughout the state, often invited to consult on challenging restoration projects. James and I grew closer, our shared passion for historical architecture creating a strong foundation for our relationship. He understood my commitment to my grandfather and the Victorian house, never pressuring me to choose between responsibilities. During this time, my mother rarely called, seemingly even more distant after her mother's death. When I mentioned this to Grandpa, he sighed heavily. "Your mother and I had a disagreement after the funeral," he admitted. "She suggested selling this house, splitting the proceeds. Said it was too much for an old man and a young woman to maintain." "You would never sell?" I said, alarmed at the thought. "Of course not. This house is more than timber and stone. It's the physical manifestation of our family history." He looked around the kitchen where we sat, his eyes seeing beyond the present moment. "I told Sarah that her mother and I had already decided the house would pass to you. She didn't take it well." As Grandpa entered his 80s, his health began to decline gradually. I noticed him moving more slowly up the stairs, pausing to catch his breath more frequently. When I suggested a doctor's visit, he waved away my concern. "I'm just getting old, Jade. It happens to the lucky ones." Despite his protests, I arranged for a thorough medical examination. The doctor confirmed what I had feared: Grandpa's heart was weakening. With medication and lifestyle adjustments, he could continue comfortably, but time was doing what it inevitably does. Knowing our time might be limited, Grandpa began sharing more family stories and house history. One evening, as we sat on the porch swing watching fireflies illuminate the garden Eleanor had loved, he told me about buying the house. "Her father thought I wasn't good enough for Eleanor, you know. I was just a carpenter, and she came from a family with some means. This house had been in her family for generations, but had fallen into disrepair when I met her." "What happened?" I prompted when he paused. "I made her father a deal. Let me restore the house room by room. If he approved of my work, he would give his blessing to our marriage." Grandpa chuckled at the memory. "Took me 2 years of evenings and weekends working alongside her father. By the end, he respected my craftsmanship, if nothing else." "And he gave his blessing." "He did more than that. He signed the house over to us as a wedding gift, with the understanding that we would always maintain it with the same care." These conversations became our evening ritual, a passing of knowledge and legacy. James often joined us, absorbing Grandpa's wisdom about buildings and life with equal appreciation. One morning in early spring, I brought Grandpa his breakfast tray to find him still asleep, a peaceful expression on his face. He had passed during the night, slipping away quietly in the home he had loved and tended for over 60 years. The funeral was smaller than Grandma's, had been attended primarily by longtime friends and neighbors. My mother arrived alone, explaining that Richard and Ethan had prior commitments. She stood beside me during the service, a stranger in expensive clothes who shared my blood but little else. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week. My mother insisted on being present, bringing Richard and Ethan with her. We gathered in the lawyer's office downtown, the atmosphere tense with unspoken expectations. Mr. Thornton, who had been my grandparents' lawyer for decades, read the straightforward document. As promised years earlier, the Victorian house and its contents were left to me, along with a modest savings account. A small sum was designated for my mother, along with specific family heirlooms Eleanor had wanted her to have. As Mr. Thornton finished reading, I noticed the tight line of my mother's mouth, the subtle exchange of glances between her and Richard. "That's it," she asked when the lawyer finished. "The house goes entirely to Jade, nothing for me beyond a few trinkets and that pittance." "Your parents were very clear about their wishes, Mrs. Campbell," Mr. Thornton replied calmly. "I'm their daughter," my mother insisted, color rising in her cheeks. "That house should rightfully come to me first, then to Jade eventually." "The will is legally sound," Mr. Thornton said. "Your parents made their decision with full mental capacity." Richard placed a restraining hand on my mother's arm. "We understand," he said smoothly. "Family homes carry emotional weight. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Jade." I felt a chill at his tone, remembering the long-ago conversation I had overheard as a child when he had convinced my mother to send me away. "There's nothing to discuss," I said firmly. "Grandma and Grandpa made their wishes clear." As we left the lawyer's office, Ethan lingered behind to examine the Victorian house model I had built for a college project which sat on Mr. Thornton's shelf. The lawyer had requested it after seeing it in a local exhibition, impressed by the detailed craftsmanship. "Nice property," Ethan commented casually. "Lot size must be what 2 acres prime location too." His interest struck me as odd, focused on the land rather than the house itself. That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet Victorian, I realized that the battle for my grandparents' legacy might not be over. 2 months after Grandpa Frank's funeral, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, somehow knowing that trouble had arrived at my door. The letter outlined a legal claim against the inheritance of the Victorian house, citing undue influence by my grandparents and questioning their mental capacity when making their will. My mother was formally challenging the inheritance, claiming that as their only child, she had been unfairly disinherited. I sat down heavily on the porch steps, the same spot where I had watched my mother drive away all those years ago. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that she had willingly given me up as a child, but now wanted to claim the house that had sheltered me. After the initial shock wore off, I began investigating more thoroughly. Through contacts at the Preservation Society, I learned that Richard's real estate development company had been struggling financially in recent years, with several projects stalled due to economic downturns. More concerning was the discovery that his company had recently purchased adjacent properties near my grandparents' land. A friend at the town planning office quietly informed me that preliminary inquiries had been made about zoning changes that would allow for condominium development in our historically single-family neighborhood. The Victorian house sat on 2 acres of prime real estate near the town center land that would be worth millions to a developer willing to tear down the historic home and build luxury condos. I contacted Amanda Reyes, a lawyer specializing in estate cases, who came highly recommended by the Historical Society. Her office was in a restored tobacco warehouse downtown, its exposed brick walls lined with legal books and local historical photographs. "They don't have a strong case legally," Amanda explained after reviewing my grandparents' will and the letter from my mother's attorneys. "Your grandparents were of sound mind, the will was properly executed, and they had the right to leave their property to whomever they chose." "Then why are they challenging it?" I asked. "Because they're hoping you'll settle rather than fight. Legal battles are expensive and emotionally draining. They're counting on you giving up a piece of the property to avoid the hassle." "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. "Good." Amanda smiled. "Because there's something else they don't know. Your grandmother consulted me 3 years ago, anticipating potential issues. We documented her reasons for the inheritance decisions thoroughly, including Sarah's abandonment of parental responsibilities when you were a child." As the legal proceedings began, I discovered that my mother was claiming she had only sent me to my grandparents temporarily and had never intended to give up custody. According to her filing, my grandparents had alienated me from her, turning me against her and manipulating her parents into changing their will in my favor. The community rallied around me. The Historical Society filed a friend of the court brief supporting the preservation of the Victorian as a historically significant property. Neighbors provided affidavits about my grandparents' mental clarity and the loving home they had provided me. Taylor's parents wrote detailed accounts of how my mother had rarely visited during my childhood, missing school events and holidays. My high school teachers recalled parent-teacher conferences attended by my grandparents, never my mother. One afternoon, I came home from work to find Richard's luxury car parked in my driveway. Richard and Ethan were walking the property line, Ethan using a measuring wheel, while Richard made notes on a tablet. "What are you doing?" I demanded, blocking their path to the backyard. Richard smiled smoothly. "Just admiring the property, Jade. It's been in the family for generations after all." "This is private property and you're trespassing," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Such hostility toward family," Richard tisked. "Your mother is very hurt by your attitude. After all she sacrificed for you." The audacity of his statement left me momentarily speechless. "The house has excellent bones," Ethan commented, looking up at the Victorian's distinctive turret. "But this land could be put to much better use. Think about it, Jade. Your share of the development profits would set you up for life." "I already have what I need," I replied. "Please leave before I call the police for trespassing." As the court date approached, the stress began affecting my health and work. I was losing sleep, constantly reviewing documents and searching for additional evidence to support our case. James stayed by my side through it all, his steady presence, a reminder that not everyone leaves when things get difficult. One sleepless night, I found myself in Grandpa's workshop, running my fingers over his tools, seeking connection to his strength. Behind his workbench, I noticed a loose board in the wall paneling. Curious, I removed it to find a hidden storage space containing a metal box. Inside were decades of documents, the original custody papers my mother had signed, transferring guardianship to my grandparents' letters she had written, explaining why she couldn't care for me, and most damning, a series of checks she had cashed from my grandparents labeled Jade's support that had continued for years despite her never contributing to my upbringing. There were also bundles of letters my mother had written to her parents during her teens and early 20s, documenting her resentment of the Victorian house and the responsibilities it represented, her determination to escape small-town life, and multiple declarations that she never wanted to inherit that old money pit. I brought these documents to Amanda, who reviewed them with growing confidence. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. Direct evidence contradicting her current claims. The most powerful items, however, were the journals Eleanor had kept throughout her life. The entries about me were filled with love and concern, but also documented my mother's absence with painful clarity. "Sarah called today after 3 months of silence," one entry read. "Jade waited by the phone all weekend for the promised follow-up call that never came. How do we heal a child's broken heart?" On the day of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a suit that had belonged to Grandma Eleanor, tailored to fit me. As I fastened her pearl earrings, I felt wrapped in the love of the two people who had truly been my parents. The courtroom was crowded with supporters. Taylor and her family sat directly behind me. Members of the Historical Society, neighbors, and even Mr. Thornton had come to show their support. My mother, Richard, and Ethan sat across the aisle, looking confident and expensively dressed. My mother avoided my gaze, studying her manicured nails as if bored by the proceedings. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, reviewed the evidence thoroughly. When Amanda presented the recently discovered documents, I saw my mother's face pale, her eyes darting to Richard in alarm. Richard's lawyer attempted to argue that the documents were irrelevant, that family relationships were complex, and that my mother had always intended to bring me back home eventually. "If that was her intention," the judge asked pointedly, "why did she sign full legal custody over to the grandparents when the child was 10? And why did she accept financial support from them without contributing to her daughter's upbringing?" My mother was called to testify, her confident facade cracking under direct questioning. When confronted with her own letters stating she never wanted the Victorian house, she claimed her feelings had changed over time. "And when exactly did this change of heart occur?" Amanda asked. "Before or after your husband's company purchased the adjacent properties for development?" The question caused a stir in the courtroom. My mother glanced at Richard, who sat stone-faced before responding. "This isn't about development. It's about family legacy. A legacy you abandoned along with your daughter," Amanda replied quietly. After 2 days of testimony, the judge ruled decisively in my favor, upholding my grandparents' will and dismissing my mother's claims. "The court finds no evidence of undue influence," she stated. "Rather, the evidence shows that Eleanor and Frank Reynolds made a thoughtful, deliberate decision based on their relationship with their granddaughter and their desire to preserve their family home." As we left the courthouse, reporters from the local paper asked for comments. Amanda handled them professionally while I stood silent, emotionally exhausted by the ordeal. My mother caught up to me on the courthouse steps, Richard and Ethan waiting in the car. "You've won, Jade. I hope you're satisfied," she said bitterly. "This was never about winning," I replied. "It was about respecting Grandma and Grandpa's wishes, about protecting the home they created when you left me behind." "I didn't have a choice," she snapped, tears forming in her eyes. "Richard made it clear I had to choose. You have no idea what that was like." "Actually, I do," I said quietly. "I was 9 years old, and I heard every word of that conversation when he convinced you to send me away. The difference is that my grandparents never made me choose. They simply loved me unconditionally." For the first time, I saw something crack in my mother's perfect facade, a glimpse of the wounded woman beneath the designer clothes and calculated smile. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," I replied simply. "And now you've tried to take away the only real home I've ever known." Richard honked the car horn impatiently, breaking the moment. My mother straightened her shoulders, composure returning. "This isn't over," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I watched her walk away, realizing that some wounds never fully heal, they just become part of who we are. In the months following the court case, I gradually rebuilt my life and the serenity that had been disrupted by the legal battle. The Victorian house, now officially and unquestionably mine, needed attention after my distracted months of litigation. I began with Eleanor's garden, which had become overgrown during my preoccupation with the court case. Pulling weeds and turning soil under the spring sunshine proved therapeutic, connecting me to my grandmother's memory and wisdom. "Gardening teaches patience," she had often told me. "You can't rush a bloom or force a seed to grow faster. Some things simply take the time they take." The same philosophy applied to my healing process. The betrayal by my mother, both in childhood and again as an adult, wasn't something I could simply forget or quickly overcome. The garden became my meditation space, where I could process complex emotions while creating something beautiful. Inside the house, I began a careful renovation project, balancing preservation with practical updates. The kitchen still had its original cabinets but needed modern appliances. The bathrooms required updating while preserving their vintage charm. Each decision was made with deliberate care, honoring the house's history while ensuring its future. James became my partner in this process, his expertise in historical restoration proving invaluable. We spent weekends stripping layers of paint from intricate woodwork, revealing the original craftsmanship beneath. "Your grandfather would approve," James said one evening as we admired a newly restored section of banister. "You're carrying on his legacy of care." About 2 months after the court victory, I received an unexpected visitor. My mother arrived alone without Richard or Ethan driving a modest rental car instead of their usual luxury vehicle. She stood awkwardly on the porch, looking smaller somehow without her husband's dominant presence. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I hesitated before stepping aside. We sat in the formal parlor, the room where generations of family had entertained guests, made important announcements, celebrated milestones. "I owe you an apology," she began, staring at her hands. "Several, actually." "I'm listening," I said, neither accepting nor rejecting yet. "Richard and I are separating," she continued, looking up briefly. "After the court case, things changed between us. The truth is, they had been changing for years, but I couldn't admit it. She explained that Richard's financial situation was worse than she had realized, his company deeply in debt. The development plan for my property had been his last desperate attempt to salvage his business. He was using you, I observed. He was using both of us, she corrected. Me for much longer. In the silence that followed, I studied the woman before me. Without the designer clothes and perfect makeup, she looked vulnerable, more like the mother I vaguely remembered from childhood. Why did you really send me away? I asked the question that had haunted me for most of my life. She took a deep breath. Richard gave me an ultimatum. He said his house, his lifestyle couldn't accommodate a child from a previous relationship. Ethan was jealous of you acting out. Richard said it would just be temporary. But it wasn't. No, she admitted, tears forming. Once you were gone, it was easier to let you stay gone. To tell myself you were better off with my parents, who could give you stability, a better education, everything I couldn't provide. You never even tried to bring me back, I said, the old hurt surfacing. I was a coward, she whispered. Each year that passed made it harder to fix what I'd broken. And then I convinced myself you didn't need me anymore, that my parents had replaced me in your life. They raised me, I acknowledged. But there was always a space for you if you had wanted it. We talked for hours, unpacking decades of misunderstandings, resentments, and missed opportunities. I didn't absolve her of responsibility, nor did she ask me to. But I began to see her as a complex, flawed human being, rather than the mythic figure of abandonment she had become in my mind. I don't expect forgiveness, she said as she prepared to leave. But I want you to know that I am proud of the woman you've become despite my failures. Your grandparents did what I couldn't. Where will you go? I asked. Back to school, actually. I never finished my degree. A small smile. It's time I stood on my own 2 feet without Richard's money or my parents' help. As she left, I didn't promise a reconciliation or regular contact. We both understood that trust once shattered must be rebuilt slowly, if at all. But the door remained open, a possibility where before there had been only finality. Richard and Ethan made no further contact. Through the local grapevine, I heard that Richard's company had declared bankruptcy and that he had moved to Florida to start over. Ethan had taken a job with a development company in another state. Their absence felt like the lifting of a shadow I hadn't fully acknowledged. With the legal issues resolved and some measure of closure with my mother, I turned my full attention to honoring my grandparents' legacy. I applied for and received historical designation for the Victorian house, ensuring it would be protected from future development. Working with the Historical Society, I converted one room into a small museum space showcasing the town's architectural history, including photographs and artifacts from my grandparents' restoration work. School groups began visiting regularly, the children wide-eyed at the high ceilings and elaborate woodwork, so different from modern construction. James proposed on a summer evening in Grandpa Frank's workshop, kneeling among the tools and wood shavings that represented the craftsmanship we both revered. This house has seen generations of love, he said, holding out a ring. I want to continue that tradition with you. The ring was a vintage piece he had found at an estate sale, the delicate filigree work reminiscent of the Victorian era. It felt right on my finger, a connection to the past and a promise for the future. With James's support, I established a foundation in my grandparents' names to help children in unstable home situations. The program provided scholarships, mentoring, and support services, trying to create for others the stability that Frank and Eleanor had given me. Houses are more than just buildings, I told a reporter doing a story on the foundation. They're vessels for memories, containers for the love and care that make a family. Every child deserves a place that feels like home. As I spoke these words, I realized how completely my understanding of family had evolved. Family wasn't defined by blood or legal documents, but by the daily choice to show up, to care, to remain present through difficulties and celebrations alike. My grandparents had made that choice for me when my mother couldn't or wouldn't. Now I was making that choice for others, extending the legacy of love they had established. The Victorian house continued to require attention and care, just as relationships do. Some floorboards needed replacing, the roof occasionally leaked, the plumbing had quirks that only I understood. But with each repair, each improvement, the bond between me and the house deepened. We had both weathered storms and emerged stronger. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch swing, where Grandpa Frank had shared his wisdom, I sometimes felt their presence in the creak of the old boards, the rustle of leaves in Eleanor's garden, the particular quality of light filtering through the stained glass transom. Not as ghosts, but as the accumulated love that had seeped into the very structure of the house and my life. The process of forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't about excusing my mother's actions or pretending they hadn't hurt me. It was about releasing the weight of anger and resentment that I had carried for so long. Not for her sake, but for my own. Just as Eleanor had advised in her final days, I was learning that forgiveness was a gift I gave myself. As I looked toward the future, planning a wedding with James, considering children of our own someday, I felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought me here. The abandonment that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, the start of a different life than I might have had, but one rich with love and purpose. The Victorian house stood as a testament to resilience, to the possibility of creating beauty from brokenness, of finding home in unexpected places. Like me, it had been neglected and then rescued its true value, recognized by those who could see beyond surface appearances to the solid foundation beneath. Have you ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours? Something that represented not just material value, but emotional significance and personal identity? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story of fighting for my home and heritage resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to hear more true life experiences, and share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that family is defined by love, not blood. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most painful chapters of our lives can lead to the most beautiful outcomes if we have the courage to keep turning the pages.